Hola a todos. Bueno, aunque this is a really all meeting, we are gonna conduct the session in English. Entonces nos vamos a hacer la sesión en Q&A en inglés. Pues nuestros speakers son más familiarizados con inglés. Uh, so I'll do the introductions, and then we can start with a round of Q&A. I expect this session to take 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. And maybe if we have time at the end, we can also open for some questions from the audience. Okay. So introducing myself, I'm Victoria Jardim from Brazil. I'm part of the board of directors of Relial. Relial is Rede Liberal da América Latina, red liberal from Latin America. I'm also a project manager for Telus Digital, and I work directly in a product, a software as a service powered by AI. And I'll be moderating this conversation that is called De los datos al poder, AI y sus impactos para la democracia occidental, or From Data to Power, AI and its impacts to occidental democracy. Our speakers, first one is Marcos Falconi. He's a project manager in Fundación Libertad and has a Master of Arts in Social Science from Chicago University and a Bachelor in Political Science from UTDT. We also have with us Daniel Castro, who is Vice President at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, and Director of ITIF Centers for Data Innovation. Castro writes and speaks on a variety of issues related to information technology and internet policy, including privacy, security, intellectual property, internet governance, e-government, and accessibility for people with disabilities. He has a bachelor's in foreign service from Georgetown University and a master in information security, technology, and management from Carnegie Mellon University. And also my colleague from Telus Digital, General Rodriguez, he has a degree in computer engineering and a PhD in microelectronics from URGS. The second one in collaboration with the École Centrale de Lyon and the Laboratory of Informatics, Robotics and Microelectronics of Montpellier in France. He is the author of a book and around 20 publications. He works as a head of data science at Telus Digital, where he leads the artificial intelligence projects. He's also a professor of natural language processing at APF in Montpellier, France, and works as a researcher in the field of artificial intelligence. So, welcome everyone. I really hope this is gonna be a very exciting session. We as we are proposing to do a couple of these along this year. So yeah. And welcome to our speakers, Daniel, Gennaro, and Marcos. Can you say a hi just to check if everything is working fine?
Hola, hola, hola a todos.
Hi everyone, happy to be here.
Great to be
Okay.
here, thanks.
Let's start then. I have a couple of questions just for initial contextualization, but I'll provide some minutes for you guys if you want to say something at the beginning. Marcos, if you want to start, I don't know.
Well, hello everyone. I think I can speak in Spanish and then we can have translation. If that's a problem, please let me know. But I think I'll do better if I continue in Spanish. Gracias, Victoria, y gracias también a Silvia y al resto del staff de la Fundación Naumann en México y Relial por la invitación a este evento. Yo podría dar unas palabras iniciales, si te parece, Victoria, sobre el contexto, ¿no? Geopolítico, ¿no? En América Latina, de los datos al poder, ¿no? Es este evento y está detrás la figura de China, ¿no? La tenemos como omnipresente, sobre todo en los últimos días, por las noticias que ha habido acerca de una empresa china justamente y sus avances, ¿no? En teoría, en inteligencia artificial, de los cuales seguramente los que son expertos en ese tema pueden hablar mejor. Pero si te parece, doy unas palabras sobre el contexto, ¿no? Eh, Empezamos a trabajar en la Fundación Libertad hace algunos años en la cuestión de la influencia autoritaria en América Latina, primero en Argentina y Chile y luego en otros países, acerca de qué es lo que hace China, ¿no? En nuestro continente y por qué China, ¿no? ¿Por qué China sería un problema para nosotros? Bueno, porque China está gobernada por el Partido Comunista Chino y es un régimen que no es democrático, ¿no? Es un régimen autoritario y que tiene una política exterior, como todos los otros países del mundo, ¿no? Donde trata de promocionarse a sí mismo. El problema es que la promoción, la autopromoción de un régimen autoritario puede ser peligrosa, sobre todo cuando la disparidad de recursos entre una nación y otra es muy importante, ¿no? Y encontramos, ¿no? A lo largo de los años y a través de distintas investigaciones, yo después hice una investigación sobre el Instituto Confucio, que es un instituto de lengua y cultura mandarín que China tiene en todo el mundo, y después un estudio también sobre la vinculación del Partido Comunista Chino con partidos políticos en general en América Latina. Hemos encontrado una estrategia que es multifacética, una estrategia que involucra aspectos económicos, culturales, políticos, y digamos, para dar un pantallazo, ¿no? Podemos decir que China se ha transformado en el primero o segundo socio comercial de prácticamente todos los países de América Latina, ¿no? Lo cual es notable, porque el dominio que antes era de los Estados Unidos ahora está muy discutido, ¿no? Y entonces al intercambio comercial se suman también inversiones, en muchos casos muy necesarias, en países que no tienen liquidez, pero donde China aparece generosa con planes de pagos que parecen convenientes. Y está hasta en los detalles, porque hemos visto, ¿no? Que China, por ejemplo, en la pandemia, ¿no? Se esforzó en hacer llegar sus barbijos y luego su vacuna, ¿no? Por supuesto que uno puede decir recibamos todo y no demos nada a cambio, ¿no? Pero el problema es la dependencia. Ya hay casos de países que no pueden cumplir, por ejemplo, con pagos a préstamos de China, como por ejemplo Sri Lanka, y esto desata crisis, unas crisis muy fuertes, porque es un freno a la inversión muy rápido y abrupto, porque China encadena sus acuerdos, ¿no? Y esto lo hace en América Latina. Si hay un problema con un acuerdo, entonces se caen otros acuerdos también. Y esto asegura que China consiga siempre su cometido, ¿no? Porque la amenaza para el país que recibe es muy grande. Algunas inversiones además son problemáticas, ¿no? Y digo, y esto tiene que ver también con el área tecnológica, ¿no? De la que vamos a hablar hoy. Por ejemplo, el caso de la base espacial que hay en nuestra provincia argentina de Neuquén, pero que en realidad está controlada por una agencia militar china, ¿no? Y a donde ningún argentino, ni siquiera el gobierno, puede entrar sin autorización de China. Este es un acuerdo que no es público, ¿no? Y que ni siquiera lo tienen diputados, por ejemplo, que en su momento eran de la oposición y que lo pidieron, ¿no? Y esto lo sé porque me lo contaron. Entonces, hay información que no existe, hay falta de rendición de cuentas. Son inversiones oscuras que vienen de China, ¿no? Y políticamente vemos que el Partido Comunista Chino quiere hacerse amigo de todos, ¿no? Lo cual es novedoso si pensamos la política como ideología, porque pensaríamos quizás que el Partido Comunista querría ser amigo solamente de la izquierda, y no es así. El Partido Comunista Chino aprovecha la debilidad económica de los países de América Latina y está entonces todo el tiempo cortejando a los políticos, ¿no? Les regala cosas. En Chile, por ejemplo, regalaban celulares Huawei a los congresistas, ¿no? Y tenemos que recordar que las empresas que son de China en realidad no funcionan como empresas occidentales. en cierto punto son empresas gubernamentales porque tienen que responder al gobierno, ¿no? Y tenemos también invitaciones, literalmente, a viajes, ¿no? Viajes a políticos de todos los partidos relevantes en gran parte de los países de América Latina para que vayan a China, se maravillen del proyecto chino de desarrollo, del progreso reciente, y luego vuelvan, ¿no? Y nos hablen de la tecnología china, por ejemplo, ¿no? Quizás ahora nos vienen a empezar a hablar de la inteligencia artificial. Esto se ha visto en políticos de todo tipo, hasta el punto de que China tiene hoy incluso expresidentes latinoamericanos que funcionan más como embajadores de China en América Latina que de América Latina en China, ¿no? Nunca nos hablan estas personas de que China es un régimen no democrático, de que hay temas de los que no se puede hablar. No nos dicen, ¿no?, que hay problemas con los derechos humanos, que no hay democracia, que en la historia se recuerdan algunos sucesos pero no otros. Y ese es el objetivo de China, que se vea lo bueno y no lo malo. Eso es lo que tratan de hacer todos los países. Pero es un problema en el caso de China por el poderío económico que tiene y el hecho de que no es una democracia, ¿no? Por eso es que nosotros tenemos que prestar atención y por eso quería dar este pantallazo así general, inicial, del contexto de la influencia de China en América Latina, ¿no? Porque bueno, con las nuevas noticias de DeepSeek, las que seguramente puedan hablar los que son más expertos, los que son expertos en realidad en inteligencia artificial, seguramente vamos a tener novedades en términos de la influencia de China en América Latina.
Gracias, Marcos, por el panorama. Thank you, Marcos, for the overview about China and its influence in Latin America and other countries as well. Um, I guess for us to wrap up the whole subject of our session today, Marcos provided us the geopolitical overview, and now I also need Gennaro and Danielle to provide some information for those who may not be super tech savvy, so that we can understand like the artificial intelligence impact generative AI, LLM, and maybe go through DeepSeek and these other companies that are generating these hot topics in the media nowadays. But Gennaro, if you could please provide us super briefly define artificial intelligence, generative AI, and LLMs. I think those are
Oh,
key concepts for us.
sure. Yeah, I want to start by thank you for the invitation. I mean, I'm a libertarian myself, so I feel very glad to be here and taking part of this discussion. I think it's a very valid discussion. I do believe that data is power. I like to make this parallel between, well, the technology that we use for nuclear and the technology that we are starting to develop for AI, because they are, I believe that they are equally powerful, and they're going to be shaping the world very strongly for the next few years, or even the years to come. Well, talking about AI is not something new, to be honest. So we have been talking about AI and what we used to call machine learning for some decades. And I think that what makes we have this AI boom that we are having right now is the fact that AI is finally strong enough to be very useful for the general public. So technologies like the ones we see with ChatGPT and DeepSeek and Gemini, etc., they have been developing for quite a while. So they are not particularly new. The new point here is that we finally have the computational power to train very large models, and also we found an architecture that helps us represent more broadly what a particular string or a particular line of information might mean, and the relation between those lines of information. But, well, to make the history short, an AI model or a machine learning model is basically a mathematical model that can predict a point in the future, having some points in the past. And when you are talking about large language models or the models used by DeepSeek or ChatGPT, we are doing exactly the same thing, but for words. So they are capable of understanding text and predict what is going to be the next word in a text or in a context. And because we have such a deep and such a complex model, they are able to give us the impression that the model is talking to us like a person. It is not really a rationalizing event like a human do in our brains. It's pretty much just a mathematical concept, but it's enough to give us the impression that you are talking with something that is intelligent enough. Now, there are some questions regarding what defines the human concept of intelligence, etc. I'm not going to get into those philosophical meanings and discussions, but as a definition for AI and machine learning, this is the mathematical definition. It's just a model, a mathematical model capable of looking at the past and trying to predict the future with a given accuracy.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the explanation. So just to be clear, there's a difference between artificial intelligence, generative AI, and the LLMs, right? And this like DeepSeek, which is this new China, is an LLM model, and we have a bunch of other ones developed from American companies and other companies, right?
Yeah. So when we're talking about generative AI, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. For the whole history of the humankind, we always try to automatize manual labor. And what we ended up by doing right now is actually automatizing creative labor. And I think that's the great leap forward in this kind of technology. So when we're talking about generative AI, we are talking about models capable of generating this creative labor, things like images or text. So that's the idea that I was explaining before. Those are models capable of generating some information that we have the impression that it didn't have before, but actually it did have this information before during the training process, etc. And when you're talking about large language models, LLMs, it is pretty much the same thing, but applied to text.
And the amazing thing is that now for us to improve the models, we don't have to increase like the architecture, we have just to increase the amount of data that we train the models, right?
Exactly. Yeah, apparently, and that's actually a little bit of counterintuitive. But what we have been seeing so far is that just by giving the models more data and more processing powers and just increasing their sheer size, we are able of achieving incredible levels of accuracy and intelligence. That's why data is so important right now and why we care so much of protecting our own data and this kind of technology, because the winner in the end is going to be the one who holds the more data and the most quality data.
Awesome. Daniel, how do you see the role of data in the fueling the current AI boom, and what are some of the key challenges in managing and utilizing this data effectively?
It's a great question because, as General was saying, so much of the advancements in AI that we've seen over the past few years has been based on the amount of data. So, you had these AI companies that said, what if we basically scrape the entire internet? We take all these books that have been digitized, we take government records, all the data that we can gather, and just feed it all into these systems, and what will happen? And what they discovered is that it's very powerful at learning. It's kind of the way a child learns, by just observing, taking in all this information and making sense of it. But one thing we've also seen as companies have started to refine these models and figure out how can they improve them, how can they make them more efficient. One of the initial papers around AI was famously titled "Attention is All You Need," which was all about these attention mechanisms in the transformer architecture network, which basically meant you could throw in lots of data and it would figure out what would work. There was a new paper out by Microsoft last year that was called "Textbooks Are All You Need." And their point was you can make highly impactful, highly accurate, highly efficient models by curating the data that you're feeding it. So instead of feeding it all of the data, everything from the internet, the blogs of, conspiracy theorists and, people opining about things that they don't know, and the intelligent information. What if we just send in the vetted information? What if we just send in the textbooks? And they found out that they could create highly capable models using significantly less data. And so the reason why this matters is we are in this kind of moment of a data gold rush where we're trying to figure out who has the data, what data do we need, and what data can solve different problems. But it's not, I think the early days, the mental model a lot of people had was a company like maybe Meta, or a Twitter that has this social media. They have so much information that they're going to be able to have this lead that nobody else has. And what we're finding out is that's not really true. What matters is that you have the right data for the right problem. And that's a very intuitive. If you think about it, you can have a brilliant doctor. They're not going to be able to treat a patient if they don't have good information about that patient. And that's the same thing that we're seeing now in so many different domains, whether it's biology, chemistry, physics, earth science. If we want to use AI and machine learning to solve these problems, we need to have very good subject matter data. And so one of the big questions is, how are we going to create a global data commons to address some of these big issues? Because if you think about something like climate change, this is where you need global data. You need weather information from everywhere in the world, not just one particular country. This data needs to be interoperable. You need to be combining data from different types of satellites. There's so much complexity to that. And that same issue exists in virtually every field. And so, it used to be, you think about maybe a problem, and we had this kind of small data model where the challenge was, well, how do I collect all the data I need in this one organization? And that's not really the problem we're going to have in the future. And the problem that we have in the future and going forward is, how do we collect and curate all these disparate data sets that are being pulled together by different types of organizations, some government, some non-government, some corporate, some non-corporate. You might have citizen scientists collecting water data about a local lake or river, but you also have a government institution doing this. How do we actually pull all this data together into a global data commons that can be used in these types of models to solve big problems? And so we have just a whole host of really interesting issues going forward, where it's a coordination problem, it's a cooperation problem, there's technical standards involved. But there's also the question of, are we even collecting the right data to solve certain problems? And I think we need to do more work in that area as well. But we're really seeing a really interesting evolution there. And the last point I'll just make about this is that, in terms of the policy side of this, there's also lots of issues that come up, for example, around intellectual property rights, privacy rights around personal data. And so all of these issues we also have to resolve, because many times we created these policies not under a world where we imagined that AI would take off the way it is and where data is so important. And if you think about, for example, the cost of everyone opting into sharing certain data, that might not be feasible. And so we need to maybe think about where there are opportunities to share data for social good, to use AI for social good, that's going to benefit us all collectively, but still, protects individual rights, but balances that with the collective.
Yes, totally agree with it. Gennaro, to Daniel's point, can you please clarify two more small concepts? I think this is going to be useful for our discussion. First one, RAG, retrieval augmented generation, and second one, guardrails.
Sure. Yeah. So when we're talking about RAG, the idea of RAG is giving those models the capacity of, reading data and then answering questions regarding this data. So if you take, again, the best example right here, ChatGPT, it has been trained with data from all over the internet. So it does have information from data from all over the internet. But let's say that you want the model to help you understand a Excel spreadsheet. What you're going to have to do is do what we call a RAG. So a RAG is basically the idea of giving this model a little bit more information. It's actually quite simple. So inside your questions, you're going to give more information to the model, information that the model didn't have prior during its process of training. So the models are capable of reading this data, understanding this data, and then answering your question regarding this data. When you're talking about guardrails, so guardrails is the idea of implementing a technical implementation to not let this model answer anything other than exactly answers related to the data that you just provided. So, a very funny case of the lack of a guardrail was actually a chatbot that was implemented by Chevrolet, I guess, on the US. So they did not implement any kind of guardrails, so the user could ask anything and get anything as a response. So basically, an user asked the chat to accept any kind of counter offer that the user would make, and that allowed the user to buy a car spending only $1 because there was no guardrail. So the model was free to answer anything it wanted to do, And because the user was asking him to be more pleasant and, well, just accepting everything, and the model is also the program to be pleasant to the user, it actually ended up selling a car for $1. So that's the kind of problems that guardrails try to avoid. They make the model, they kind of limit the intelligence of the model and the kind of answer the model can provide. They are actually used for safety, to make sure that the model is not going to be generating hateful comments, for example, like saw in the past with models trained using X or Twitter data sets.
Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so changing our topic a little bit, but when we talk about AI and model efficiency, and just to tackle a very important topic that Danielle mentioned, and is part of this global discussion, I was watching some of the Davos discussions around AI, and they tackle a lot on this point, which is energy and the sustainability of this AI world, right? Daniel, I read your report. It's called Rethinking Concerns About AI's Energy Use. Super interesting. We can let the link into the comments of our YouTube channel for those who wants to read later. But what you can tell us about the increasing energy demands of AI, and can you paint a picture of just how much energy is needed to train and run these massive AI models, and how can we deal with it?
Absolutely. I think we've all probably seen some of the headlines about AI's energy use skyrocketing and potentially really, running rampant and out of control in the years ahead if you extrapolate the amount of energy being used today and where it goes. One of the things that's really interesting is so many of the concerns we see about AI, whether it's the impact it has on children, its effect on privacy, how it's going to change culture. We've seen all these things before. And so it's always really interesting to go back and look at past debates around technology. For example, when people started buying and selling goods online back in 2000, there was an article that talked about if Amazon kept growing at this pace, its data centers would, be 20% of the energy footprint of the world. It was this massive cost. And that's some of the concern that we've seen around AI. And the reason for this is because most of the assessments that have been done of AI models have been done of early stage experimental models that were created to focus mostly on improvements in performance, so improvements in the accuracy of the model, not in improvements in the efficiency of the model. So many of the models, early models, aren't very efficient. But another problem is a lot of the estimates were wrong. So, for example, one famous estimate that's making the rounds and pretty much every high-profile newspaper article found that training a large language model generated about 600,000 pounds of CO2 emissions, which is roughly the equivalent of 300 round-trip flights from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. The problem with that estimate is that it was wrong. First of all, when they actually looked at the real numbers later on, when they got better data, the actual emissions were about 88 times smaller than that. And second of all, the particular model they were looking at really wasn't equivalent to what most people are thinking about when they're thinking about the type of large language models, chatbots that we're using today. It was really an AI model that was trying to train and identify the optimal LLM. So it was basically doing a giant network search for which is a highly kind of inefficient process. But the takeaway from this is that what we see over time is that we see steady improvements in accuracy, and as those improvements occur, more energy is used. But as these systems are actually deployed and operationalized, there's a lot of focus on how do we improve the efficiency of those systems. So, for example, if you look at Google's, which releases transparency reports on their CO2 emissions and energy profile, the amount of energy they're using on AI has stayed consistent over the past years that they've reported. Even as AI use has gone up, it's still remained about 18% of their global CO2 footprint. And that's because, again, there's always a focus on efficiency. And this came out recently with DeepSeek, where, there was so much, noise about, how much more efficient this model was. But that's exactly what, if you look at the historic data, that's exactly what you would predict. You see that there is a huge emphasis on efficiency because as you operationalize something, there's a lot you can do. So for example, right now with these AI models, there's something called pruning, where you basically take out parts of the AI model that aren't being used until you make it more efficient when you're running it. In this case, they also made it significantly more efficient to develop. Now that said, that's one approach. You do have companies like OpenAI that are really focused on building larger and larger models, and those will use more energy. But the question will be, well, ultimately, they still have to have a business model that's effective. People have to be willing to pay for the service. It's not that we're going to replace Google with a highly inefficient service that costs tons of money to run. And so that's where there's this optimization that continues to come up, and that's why we see that the numbers come down. We also see some really interesting innovations around smaller models. So again, many companies, when you see the releases, they always kind of tout the big models. But a lot of developers are actually using the small models that you can run maybe on a cell phone or a small mobile device because they want to embed AI in different places, or they're just paying by query and they need something more efficient. So there's a lot of work on those smaller models as well. And then, of course, there's just other types of investments that AI is actually helping spur in clean energy. So you have companies like Microsoft that have invested in reviving the 3 Mile Island nuclear project, and other investments in solar and wind because they want to have clean energy to power these AI models. So the main takeaway for me is that, yes, energy demand will go up. I think we've seen estimates that, it might go up by maybe 25% more over the next 5 years than it is now for data centers. But that's in line with just kind of growing digitalization of the economy. And there are trade-offs there. When you do more things digitally, you're substituting something that you might have been doing in person. And so you have to look at the net benefits there. So for example, if you're able to have a very high quality video conference call, because of the fact that you don't need to get on a plane and travel, there's savings there. So on net, we're waiting to see exactly what the impact will be. But in general, it shouldn't be out of line with other types of digital progress that we've seen in the past.
Awesome. Thanks. Gennaro, anything you want to add about this?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with Daniel regarding DeepSeek. So, I mean, it's true that it was a little bit shocking to have such a model coming from China, but it was not out of the ordinary. That was exactly the kind of model that we were predicting to be launched in the following months. I mean, the fact that it comes from DeepSeek, from China, it was a little bit surprising, but it was not out of the ordinary. There are some technologies that we have been developing to reduce the energy footprint of the models, like pruning, for example, which is just like cutting off some parts of the model that are redundant or not as useful. There's also quantization. So the idea from quantization is, well, we can think about the model just like numbers saved in a very large memory, right? And that's what we call the parameters of the model. Those numbers are represented by bits inside the computer memory. And what you can do is lowering the numerical precision of the model weights so that you use less bits and thus less memory to represent the same model, losing a little bit of precision and accuracy, but not that much, so that the model becomes much more less expensive to be run. And there is also distillation, which is actually the process of trying to transfer the knowledge from a large model to a smaller one. That's what we believe DeepSeek has done to create their latest model. There are very strong indications that DeepSeek has been using distillation to train their own model using GPT-4, which actually shouldn't be, well, it doesn't follow the guide rules for GPT, let's just say that. There also has been some developments on hardware-aware optimization, such as training the tailored models on more specialized hardware like TPUs or low-powered GPUs, which are basically the graphical processing units, right? The kind of hardware that's used to train this kind of models. So even what we call a neuromorphic chip, which is basically a novel hardware system that is developed from the ground up to be running natural language processing and LLMs and other kind of machine learning and AI models. And they are, because of that, much more energy efficient to run this kind of models. So yeah, I mean, we have been doing a lot of work here and a lot of progress. There's also this paper from Microsoft from 2 years ago called the Tiny Histories, where they basically proved that we could use a much tinier model, and this model could be much more performatic than a much larger model for a particular task. So again, the idea of over-specializing a much smaller model, and because it's going to be over-specialized for a single purpose, is actually going to be much more performatic than the much larger models that are for generalistic usage. So yeah, we are definitely moving towards using smaller models and more efficient ones. We cannot say that we're going to spend less energy on that, because we're also using more models, but that's another question.
Yeah, no, totally got it. I guess, yeah, energy consumption will increase, but part of this it's gonna be solved by technology efficiency itself. That we are still getting into the curve that is gonna go down again. But part of this, at least some of our politicians friends are trying to solve by themselves, right? Or at least discussing to solve by themselves. So discussing which type of energy they can use. I know that Brazil presented a plan, for example, in Davos, to bring a couple of data centers to here, since we have a very clean energy matrix. So this type of uh, discussions are happening right now and happening for real, right? And considering the libertarian viewpoint on the limits of government investment, how can we balance the support for AI research and development with the need to avoid overspending and ensure the efficiency of the investments? And do you see, and do you, this question is for the three of you, do you see risks that this type of investment will become another source of money laundering from our governments and politicians, since few people really understand the technical part and it's a field where everything is very new? And what do you guys think about initiatives like Stargate project, for example?
Happy to start. I think I saw a quote from Sam Altman saying, when he got back from a conference, everyone was asking him from every country, how can we get our own Stargate? That was the number one question he was getting. And so I think the risk is that, yes, I think a lot of governments look at a big announcement like this and say, oh, that looks like a lot of foreign investment. I want that. I want a piece of that. What do I need to do? And there's two problems with that. One, sometimes they're chasing kind of not the old technology in this case, but everyone doesn't need to have a data center. That's not the goal. The goal is everyone's using AI in their economy as productively as possible. And so we have to remember what the goal is. The reason, obviously, these US companies were trying to get Stargate, or they're trying to get more data centers, is they want to make sure that when they're competing with China, that computation, access to computing resources is not the bottleneck that holds them back. It's not that would make them fail. And so it's important that there is access to cheap compute for uses and users, and countries can certainly think about that, can think about maybe their government uses that they have access for. They can think about in academia, are they making it affordable? But I think you're right. I mean, there's a risk that they start throwing money at things they don't really understand, or doesn't really get them anywhere. And I think the balance here, and I think what kind of aligns with a more libertarian perspective, is say, well, what are the actual market barriers and government barriers that are being put up in place? And the reason it's actually the reason that you have, for example, President Trump being involved in that Stargate announcement is because these investors, they want to see that it's actually easy to build these data centers. And there's so much complexity around permitting for construction, permitting for creating new energy generation or connecting to the grid. That's the barrier. And so, when governments are saying, well, what do we need to do to get the next Stargate? It's not about, just trying to trick someone into investing in this, or it's really about, do you have the optimal environment for investing in building in your country? What's the red tape? What's the regulatory risk that's being created for investors when they come forward with a project, and they might not know for 12 months whether or not their new generator is even going to be allowed to connect to the grid. Those are the challenges that hold things back. And so I think when countries are looking at this, they have to be saying, well, are we actually an optimal destination for this type of investment? Or are we even an optimal destination for building data centers just internally? I mean, that's something that's important even if you're not getting big investment. And so I think those are areas where, just like with, for example, building 5G, towers, you have to start looking at the telecom regulations. You have to look at the spectrum regulations, see how to make it more efficient. And you do the same thing around data centers.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I think we should just let the engineers and scientists do what they do best, which is producing more technology. It's not only about money, right? I mean, you have seen today that Europe just issued a new decree to invest around, I think it was 200 billion euros on development of AI. However, the European Union has been implementing so much regulation that I personally don't think that they're going to be able to develop very strong AIs in the near future. It's not only about having money to invest, but also having the freedom to make these investments turn out into something good. I think that the sad truth, and that's something that is hard for us to swallow, is that China has some kind of a leverage because of the state cooperation, while the West sometimes has to struggle against the state to have the liberty to produce this kind of technology. So, I just gave the example of European Union, right? It's very hard to develop a very strong AI when you have to be afraid of overusing data or with too regulated privacy concerns. While we know that our Chinese counterparts, they have the power of the state and the Communist Party with them. And we all do know that China is not very preoccupied with people's privacy, right? So I wouldn't be shocked to find out that some of those Chinese companies have access to a lot of data that they shouldn't, even regarding the West and the population from the West, not only from Chinese people. So I mean, we are in an uneven competition here, I think.
Victoria, if I may, I'll switch to English since we're all doing English. I'm sorry, I spoke in Spanish earlier. I thought some of you would. But I like to say, I think like Daniel said, lifting government barriers is key, because I think the private sector has enough incentives to do research on AI by itself. I mean, the potential for business is pretty large. It's large enough so that we can rely on the private sector to do research. But Gennaro was talking, in my view, correctly about the edge that China has, because, and I wouldn't call this state cooperation, but rather state coercion, that China directs resources, public resources, towards its foreign policy goals, and it forces companies to to do anything, basically, because it's in the law, it's in the Chinese law. There's no such thing as a rule of law in China, and that allows government to intervene in companies by as much as it likes. And so it is true that China may have this edge because it's an authoritarian regime. And so if the state, if Western governments are going to intervene on AI, I think it's important to bring in experts, actual engineers, people that actually have some idea of what they're talking about. I think we need to have some sort of meritocracy attached to these positions, because it is definitely an issue, like you were asking, Victoria, that a potential issue could be to overspend or spend poorly. And we've all seen what's been happening with American cooperation funds these past weeks. USAID cannot be repeated. I mean, we had the US sending foreign aid going to left-wing magazines in Argentina. I mean, and if it sounds crazy, it's because it is. We can't have that. If we're going to allocate resources, if we're going to cooperate among governments or do internal research, funds need to be allocated properly. And so it is the experts who should decide on that. If we decide that there's not enough incentives for the private sector to intervene, which I think there are.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Uh, yeah, I think right now, at least right now, like we have a lot of private companies investing a lot and being the top players in the game, but we are seeing the government and the state starting to also jump in this AI battlefield, and trying to also provide support, money, infrastructure, uh, etc., as I mentioned. And in this sense, Marcos, do you think we can call this phenomenon as new Cold War, like between United States and China this time? Like this pursuit of global power dominance around data? Because as I think I've read a couple of times, data is the new oil, and if you have the data, you have the power. So do you see this as a new, like, Cold War, and how do you believe AI is influencing on this dynamics?
Victoria, that's a great question, because I think intuitively you would think that there would be some sort of war between the US, Cold War, let's call it, between the US and China on trade and on data, because data is the new source of wealth these days in the age of services. But then, after Trump rose to power, one of the measures he took, and he took many, which is why we forget about many, it was to sort of pardon TikTok, right? Which is a Chinese-based company. And there was a lot of discussion and debate in the US on why, the US was banning TikTok, because this was happening. Like 2 months ago, it was a fact. It was going to happen. TikTok was going to be banned in the US. And why? Why was that so? Because of data concerns. Because Chinese-based companies need to collaborate with, are forced to collaborate with the government, with the Chinese government, on whatever the government requests. And so the data of Americans thought was in jeopardy. And so I would have expected Trump to continue with this ban, but then he didn't. He chose to allow to give an extension period to TikTok, and it doesn't seem like TikTok is going to be banned in the United States. And so I wonder what's the strategy, if there is a strategy, because it doesn't seem to me that Trump is a fan of liberty and just decided that Americans are free to use TikTok regardless of how their data are used. There's got to be another reason, but I can't think of that reason. If the next day he announces, tariffs all over the world because he wants to make America great again in the context of global competition with China. So I think this is an open question. I think we should expect to see, we would have expected to see a more clear rivalry between the US and China, and perhaps also between the US and Russia. But then just today, we're seeing that the US is approaching Putin, and perhaps trying to end the Ukraine invasion, with results that are probably not going to be good for Ukrainians, but that signal that the US and Russia are getting closer. So we might see the same thing with the US and China. I'm not sure. I really do think this is an open question.
Thanks. Danielle, beyond technology, what are the strategic implication of this AI competition for global power dynamics like trade and security of this data? How do you
Yeah.
see this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting moment right now in terms of how AI is impacting not just some of these big issues, but how it's impacting economic competitiveness, how it's impacting different societal issues. I think there's a really good comparison if you think about the early days of the internet, where the internet was seen as a tool for empowering democracies. It was seen as a tool for free markets. It was seen as a tool for free speech and just freedom online. There's this idea really that kind of ultimately proved to be incorrect, but there's this declaration of independence that was written that said basically now people are going to be free of government because we're going to live in cyberspace, and we and government isn't going to be able to regulate us there. And obviously that's not quite true, and that's not how things have panned out. And it's also not true that that the internet was this kind of universal kind of force for good for democracies. It's also a tool. It's a tool for empowerment, but it's a tool for oppression. I mean, we see how it's being used by governments to control populations. And so, I think the same thing is true with AI, right? It's very neutral as a tool. It can be used in very empowering ways. It can be, we can't expect it to be used in controlling ways. And I think what's missing right now from a lot of the conversations around AI is a recognition that we actually need to be talking about, commitments to freedom in AI and what that means for our societies, in the same way that, again, I think we were too idealistic about the internet, but we were in the right direction. We were saying, the point of the internet is now we can buy and sell, we can have global commerce in ways that we couldn't have before. And the recognition that means lowering some of these barriers to trade, recognition that now it meant anyone can publish online, right? And we need to make that possible. And so with AI, now there's, AI will be an intermediary to how people access information, how people also communicate information. And so we can absolutely expect governments are going to try to restrict AI in certain ways. When we talk about guardrails for safety, those guardrails are also guardrails for censorship. It just depends on how you look at it. And that's going to be a huge issue going forward. And so, think about, protecting free trade in this space. I mean, we're already seeing this debate play out, especially around open source AI models, where, some companies are just releasing the models on the internet. Anyone can use them for any purpose. And that's looking a lot like the debates in the 90s around encryption that are still going on today about, can we put this out there for everyone to use? Do you have the right to access any code, any models? There's going to be issues around protecting, cultural, artistic, and scientific interest. Governments wanting to say that, certain information should be restricted, or that they have, moral interest in doing things. There's going to be concerns about responsible speech, transparency. And so I think we really need to be thinking about what is freedom, just like freedom on the internet, what does freedom look like with AI? That to me it's hugely important. And when we kind of pair up this contrast between the West and China, or the US and China, I mean, I think that's an important contrast. And I'm not trying to I'm not trying to equate the two in any way, but I don't think we can rely on the US or the West to necessarily fully embrace freedoms either. And so, even though we want to say, well, we kind of want the Western model to win out over the authoritarian China model, well, yes, but we also want to make sure that if that wins out, it's actually the one we want. And so I think that's an important part of the types of conversations we need to be having now about what does that freedom look like? What does that lack of censorship look like? How do we make sure that we're not seeing, government start, saying, well, we really don't like when these models say X or Y, or, basically having this Department of Truth embedded in an AI model, because that would be hugely problematic.
I couldn't agree more. I was gonna do the same joke when Gennaro mentioned like guardrails for safety, because I totally see it being used as some sort of censorship or control. But yeah, I think this is a very good discussion. this is where what we have to discuss, like ethical boundaries, and the importance of freedom in AI. And in this sense, what are the most pressing ethical concerns surrounding the use of AI nowadays, particularly when it comes to sensitive data like personal information, for example? And
Yeah.
how can
So,
we mitigate this? I don't know if there is a way.
yeah, so I am not as worried about privacy invasion and well, breaches on personal privacy regarding data, as well as I am with censorship. I don't think we can consider ourselves to be free if we don't have enough information regarding the truth. And people are starting to use models like GPT as a source of truth. So, I mean, as someone just said on the chat, just try asking DeepSeek anything regarding Taiwan or Tiananmen Square. So I mean, those models on this kind of technology is capable of rewriting the past and history, and that's something that I'm greatly concerned with. So regarding privacy and data security and even lack of transparency and accountability when we're talking about companies in the West, for example, well, we have to think about what our data is being used for. So when you produce data on Meta or Facebook or Instagram, well, they are basically using our data to tailor ads for us. I mean, that's not something a villain would do, right? So I'm not particularly too much worried about that. I'm worried with what states can do with this kind of data. That's why I worried with the actions of China. So we cannot rely in any state, either from the West or from the East. But companies are not state. DeepSeek is controlled by the state. So that's where the problem relies. So, I mean, I find it a little bit laughable when people have this idea of using the state to control what companies can do with AI. Well, what companies really do with AI? I mean, they provide us with better products and better ads and sometimes even better liberty, right? But if you compare what the state can do with data and AI, I mean, that becomes very troublesome, right? I mean, they can start following you. It can be a really problem for our privacy and our personal privacy. So that's where my problem relies really is what the state can do with this kind of technology. That's why, I mean, I do believe that we are starting to see some kind of AI Cold War. I wouldn't say it's a Cold War. I would say like it's a cold race, I guess. Is almost like we are all running up to see who's gonna get the nuclear bomb first, right? Which is like the big model, the AGI model, artificial general intelligence model, which is gonna be the model to rule them all, and which is gonna be powerful enough to give a lot of power to a very short amount of people. But I do worry about things like privacy invasion and data security and lack of accountability when this kind of technology is in the hand of the states, and what they can do with that. So things like trying to predict a crime from happening, for example. That's something that we have been seeing in some places, like in the United States a while ago, they were trying to use machine learning models and AI models to try to predict the probability of a convict to commit another crime if they are let go from prison. And they were using this machine learning model as a source of truth, and they found a lot of racial bias and background bias on those models. So that's an issue, of course. But again, those are not models being used by companies. Those are models being used by the states and by governments. So I think that, especially when we see the media and read the media, I think that our concerns are ill-defined and ill-focused. I don't see any reason why a company, at least a Western company that do not answer to any kind of particular dictatorship, would gain anything from using our privacy or private data for anything bad. Then we could maybe philosophize regarding things like credit score or health score and how could this could impact the prices of well, certain products like security products, etc. But again, this is just those are just things that they already do using other sources of technology and other sources of data. This is not something new that's going to be starting, that they're going to start to use because now they have AI. So well, that's my problem here, and I think that's something that is very hard to fix and to mitigate. I mean, how can you mitigate the usage of data by the state, right? We don't have power to do that. The state has power to do that, and thus we have to rely into a government that, I mean, that follow the same guidelines and the same ethical and moral concerns that we do, which is the libertarian concerns, the individual privacy and meritocracy, etc., etc. But yeah, I think that's a problem very hard to mitigate.
Awesome. Marcus, do you want to add anything on this topic of ethics and how government use our data? And do you see any difference between how United States is handling this and how China handled this? Not only with AI, but maybe with some other platforms, as you mentioned, and the liberty of freedom of speech and etc.
Yeah, sure. So there is I think, a fundamental difference in between how democracies, liberal democracies, and autocracies work, and that reflects on how they handle our data. We've seen many complaints over the years that big companies, big tech like Meta and Google and all these businesses have too many data from us. In many cases, that's our own fault because we just advertently refuse to read the terms and conditions of the services that we use, and so we just click on accept and everything, and then we'll basically give them everything that they know about us. In some other cases, it's trickier. It is sometimes businesses that sort of trick us into giving them some data. But all in all, as long as there's in general a rule of law, data privacy laws, checks and balances in general, I think that the problem is contained, so to speak. But that's not the case in regimes where there is no such thing, where there is no justice, where judges are controlled by governments or by autocracies, and that's the case of China. And so if China handles our data just by default, I'm more worried than if an American company is doing the same, because I know that what Americans want is to make money. All in all, they want to, deliver to the stakeholders. But I don't really know what China wants. I mean, they probably want to make more money, but they may also want to export their model, their political model, and their political model is dangerous for us. I think, well, Sigi or someone else was saying earlier in the conversation in the chat, try asking DeepSeek about Taiwan or Tibet, right? And so, and with data, it's a similar concern. What they do probably reflects on their goals, on their political goals. And that's a very different question. I may be upset that my data is are getting used by companies to profit from me, right? But that's a different thing than having my data used to undermine institutions in my own country, because I value liberal democracy. I don't want that last thing to happen, which is why I think we need to be more careful and pay a lot more attention to these problems when they arise in non-democratic countries like China.
I can add on, I agree with Marcos, what you're saying there. I'd say, in addition to the privacy problem, we also have to think about the flip side of it, which is that for many people, it's not going to be that too much data is collected about them and how it's used. It's going to be that too little data is collected about them, and they're basically invisible in data sets, and that's going to be hugely problematic for them. And if you think about something like healthcare, for example, if your genotype isn't represented in the data set, you're not going to be receiving the health treatments that are designed for you. If your community is not represented in the air quality monitoring, the government might not be paying attention to how it's impacting your health. And we see this issue come up again and again where, we talk a lot about the digital divide and how to close that, but there's really now this data divide and this idea of kind of the people who are invisible in data sets or communities that are invisible in data sets and how we need to close that gap. And the second issue that I want to emphasize, and again, I think Marcos, you were talking about this, is there's a big difference in market-driven decisions around AI and government-driven decisions. Because when you see, the concerns that we have about, for example, bias in an algorithm, I mean, some of that is legitimate. But if you see, for example, a bank that's making biased decisions about who it's loaning, extending credit to, that's a market opportunity for another bank to come in and fill. And so, while there could be, systemic problems there too, in general, we're going to see a trend towards, closing those gaps, finding those problems and fixing that. And it's very different when you're talking about, government-driven decisions, AI decisions, because that's where you really need transparency to fix things. If, the Weather Channel predicts that it's going to rain tomorrow and they're wrong, their prediction doesn't make it rain, right? But when the government predicts that, I owe more on taxes or that they want to arrest me or anything like that, they do follow through on that decision. So that prediction does have real world consequences. And I think that's where there really needs to be a focus on transparency and accuracy and oversight, accountability for government use of AI in ways that we don't see for the market. But one thing I will just add in, because General, I think you were mentioning what was Compass. It was a program in the U.S. to predict recidivism. There's some really interesting research that came out. So there was a ProPublica study that first kind of reported on this and talked about the bias. But then there were some additional studies, including from some professors at Carnegie Mellon. And basically, what they looked at is they found that there was an inherent trade-off between equalizing the predictive accuracy of the model and equalizing the false positive rates. And there's this inherent tension that you basically can't have both of those be equal if the underlying base rates of recidivism is different between different populations. And so what they found is that the algorithm actually was set up correctly to have predictive accuracy that was the same across different races, but then its false positive rates were different across races. And so you could correct that. You could go the other way and you could make sure the false positive rates were the same across races, but then the predictive accuracy would be wrong. And just mathematically, there's no way that you can have both of these be true. And so one of the challenges we also have in these situations is we need to make sure we're actually thinking through what's the problem we want to solve and are we solving it the right way? Because there was a lot of critique of this as an AI problem, and it was really an inherent kind of fairness problem. Are we doing justice correctly? In the United States, are we thinking about how we treat prisoners and deciding about whether they're free or not in a fair way? And that's a legitimate conversation to have, but it wasn't really necessarily an AI conversation. But a lot of things become AI conversations as soon as you use AI to do it. And so I think that's just one of the challenges here. And it's just the same thing we've seen with false arrests in the United States. There's been a number of headlines about false arrests based on facial recognition, where again, the issue wasn't really a facial recognition issue. It was a policing issue. And it was an issue of, we have a lot of false arrests in the United States. And that's a much bigger issue and a much bigger deal than, the very small instances of kind of racial bias in these algorithms. And so I think that's another important thing as we're moving forward, is thinking through, are we actually solving the bigger problem rather than just the small AI piece of some of these problems? Because there are some really big problems out there that, AI is maybe helping inadvertently draw attention to.
Thanks, Daniel. Super interesting points. Okay, I guess we still have 20 minutes, and since this is radial, I couldn't end up without making you some questions about the impacts in Latin America itself. So I'll do a couple of questions about that now. The first one is, what are the main barriers to AI adoption and development in the region, such as infrastructure limitations, skill gaps, educational gaps, or funding constraints? How do you see that?
I would say that the biggest barrier right now would be a skill gap. And when I say a skill gap, it's not like our engineers are not capable enough. It's just that they don't have the foundational knowledge. And we don't have companies that have developed this foundational knowledge and invested in our local communities. And I mean, we do have very skilled people, and that's why we export so many engineers abroad, right? But I mean, regarding infrastructure limitations, I mean, yeah, I mean, we don't produce as much energy as the United States and China and Europe does, but we do produce enough to fuel a lot of machine learning models. And funding constraints, I wouldn't say it's. I mean, yeah, I mean, we have less money to fund our entrepreneurships, but I think that we can do a lot with not a lot of money, particularly in the field of AI, if you are trying to innovate. And but regarding skill gaps, the problem is that we haven't started to develop this technology in-house in Brazil or Latin America yet. That's the same case of China, actually. So the Chinese are very good in the imitation game, but they are not yet as good as the Americans in innovation. So that's why it's very unfair to say that the DeepSeek did with $80 million what OpenAI took billions to have. I mean, they didn't innovate, actually. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration from my part. They did innovate, but you cannot say that they only spent $80 million because OpenAI had to develop a whole new science and a whole new engineering process and new architectures that the Chinese could just steal from papers and from data distillation and data and distillation through model training. But there's a lot of things we can do, and I think that the first step is doing the imitation game. And then we can start developing our own technologies. That's what the Japanese have done after the Second World War, and now they are technological powerhouse. Well, they are struggling with that in the past few years, but they used to be a technological powerhouse. And well, Chinese are very good in the imitation game, not very good in the innovation game so far, but they're gonna get there with enough investment in education and foundational education. And I think that that's the same path that Latin America should take. There's a lot of places where we excel at. So, for example, Brazil is a powerhouse for agriculture technology, and that's somewhere we should and could apply AI to and have even better results. So there's a lot of opportunities here. It's just about starting to do things.
Awesome.
Add on that, there's a Anthropic put out this new study, I think this week really, on they're calling it the Anthropic Economic Index. Anthropic is one of the major AI companies. They do the Claude model, right? And so what was interesting is that they broke down the use of their models by sectors. And this is the first data I've seen on anything like this. And not too surprisingly, the largest use is around computer and mathematical sector. So basically using these models for coding, which is number one. I mean, it was like 38% almost of the use was for that. And then everything else was significantly smaller. So like, arts and media, education, nothing else really almost broke 10%. It got quite low pretty quickly. But that shows kind of, where the big productivity benefits are right now, right? The biggest uses are coders that are using this to do things much more efficiently. But we're seeing that rollout of AI, especially, as we get these more domain-specific models. And that's also where there's these big opportunities, for countries that are looking at, well, okay, specifically, yeah, if, I'm focused on, agricultural technologies, nobody's really using AI to massively innovate in this space. So, how can countries do that? And I think that's where there's, these specialized opportunities. So many countries early on were asking this question about, do we need a national large language model just for ourselves? And the answer is really no. That's not what you need. You need sector-specific, AI models that really help your sectors that you're leading in today, be more productive, be more capable, and that's where there's real big opportunity. And that's again where having a good innovation ecosystem helps. If you have that partnership between academia and the private sector in particular, can be really useful.
Can you guys provide some examples of these use cases, like applicable ones? Because I still think that when people think about AI, they still think a lot about copilots, assistants, the chat itself, and how to increase like day-by-day activities. But if you have, any industry examples of AI using, and I don't know, maybe if you have any example in Latin America, I guess would be nice.
I think I can give one regarding agriculture. So it's usually very hard to calculate the credit score for agribusiness, for a producer. And I mean, usually you would have to hire someone to go to the farm and measure it and try to estimate what was the past crop yield and estimate the future, etc. One thing that we have been using AI to help in that aspect is actually using images from satellites to take pictures of properties and then calculating their vegetation index and training AI models to predict what is going to be the crop yield and the production of certain properties. And in process of this kind of information, you can much more reliably calculate a safe credit score for this given producer. And that has been particularly very important in Brazil because we have a lot of very, small farms and a lot of producers that are in need of credit, but it's very hard for them to access credit and have a reliable credit score. So this can actually help us democratize access to credit in agribusiness in Brazil and not other Latin American countries.
Thanks, General. Okay, I think I am out of questions. Maybe we can open for one or two if the audience has any.
Victoria,
Yep.
if I may, I want to add
Sure.
something to your original question of what we can do in Latin America. Because of this challenge, of the challenges that Gennaro and David and Daniel, I'm sorry, we're talking about, particularly with regards to money and the lack thereof. I think that one thing that we can do in Latin America to improve research on AI is to improve our business environment, which of course is different across Latin America. Some countries have nicer business environments than others, but in general, Latin America is not a region that is known for technological progress or let's call it technological innovation. If we want Latin America to become a hub of innovation or some specific part of Latin America, a nation or a city, we need to improve our business environments so that they're up to the same standards that are, for example, in Silicon Valley, where this kind of talent is based. If we want to attract that kind of talent, if we want to generate the results that those people are generating in the US or in some other places, we need to offer them the same conditions because otherwise they're not going to come. So that's my 2 cents on it. I think we need to improve our business environments if we want to if we want to get some actual technological innovation and research on AI.
Awesome. Yeah, I think universities also play a very important role about the research. Of course, you can collaborate with universities all around the globe, but I think it's super important for you to have a solid, for you to have a solid hub of technology. It's important to have like not only a business but also a strong academia to handle it. Thanks, Marcos. Awesome.
I think that we need an academia with the right mindset, though. I mean, I'm from academia, and I'm from the federal academia from Brazil, and I mean, Latin American academics, they sometimes struggle with accepting money from companies. They think that the companies are somewhat trying to steal their technology, whatever that means. So we need a shift on the mindset of Latin American scientists and engineers, and that's something that you can only do through education. And that's not something that I'm thinking we're going to see in the near future, but that's something that we can achieve by educating the new engineers and scientists to a new way of seeing science development, and a more make them more acceptable to foreign investment and company investments.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When I meant academia, I meant like the cooperation with private sector, not like only the research and production of knowledge, but the cooperation between both. I think this is something super important. Uh, um, well, to have the potential for us to innovate. Um, well, yeah, totally agree with you that we have to change the mindset here a little bit, especially in our city. But yeah, okay. Uh, I'm, but yeah, and maybe fun fact, just because like we are having this discussion, but uh, maybe my my quotation, my sentence sounded a little bit, could sound a little bit weird, because like data science engineers, the developers, like technological ones, they usually are known as the ones that drop university or drop academia. uh, but if you are in the private sector working with them, you know the importance of this research, especially on data science fields, and that's why I mention it, because specifically because of AI, right, Gennaro? Um, okay. I'm officially out of questions. I don't know if we have any questions from the audience. Otherwise, I'll just thank our speakers and maybe give them some time to just do a quick closure. But yeah, I see Sigi, you had the hands up.
Yeah, but we can go to the close up. I just wanted to ask whether DeepSeek doesn't show that there might not be all that much of a first mover advantage, and that the technology of AI will probably diffuse, so it won't be basically just restricted to the US and China, but that basically everybody can get in on the act.
Yeah, I believe that what DeepSeek shows is that it is very easy to imitate, but not particularly that it's easy to innovate. So yeah, I think that every time that you have an innovation, we're gonna have a wave of imitations in development, in economies under development, or that don't have this particular science capability yet. That's very easy to do, as DeepSeek has proved. But again, the innovation is the key here. And as we were talking about before, what DeepSeek achieved was not out of the ordinary. That was straight to the point on what has been predicted by all of the consulting firms and analysts all over the world. So yeah, and I think that for the future and for the near future, what is going to change the game here is innovation, not imitation. The models that we have right now are just growing up in size or shrinking in some cases, but they are not really achieving anything more special than the previous ones. They are just improving on the same architecture and in a same style. So we are desperately in need of innovation, and that's something that China is yet to prove capable of doing, at least on the AI field. That's only my opinion. I might be wrong.
I guess I push back a little bit on that, Gennaro, in terms of, if you look at, I agree that for a long time they were more the fast follower in AI. And if you look at the first wave of AI companies, they were mostly these ones that were focused on things like image processing, so a lot of facial recognition. If you look at the new wave, what's interesting to me about these companies is that in that first wave, they were all the founders and CEOs and top technologists were coming from American universities. They were Chinese individuals studying American universities for the most part and came back to China. But if you look at the new companies, they're all coming from Chinese universities. These are top graduates at Tsinghua University. They're, and they're going on to found the companies. They're a lot younger. It's this kind of new generation. And so, I agree with you. I mean, with DeepSeek, I agree with much what you said about DeepSeek. I think if you look at some of the other AI companies in this space in China that are, putting out models that are, on the leaderboards, across the board in terms of performance, benchmarks of how the AI systems perform, they're doing things, the same way as Mistral, the same way as Llama, and they've increasingly shrunk that gap. If you look back, 12 months ago, there was a pretty big gap in performance, and now that gap is getting smaller and smaller in terms of the top Chinese models. And so I don't think they've surpassed the US yet. I think they're getting very close. And to me, the most important lesson is that every time China said they want to dominate an industrial sector, an advanced technology sector, I mean, you look at photovoltaics, and how far they came in a short period of time, and now they dominate. They've said they want to do the same thing with AI. And they said they want to do the same thing with, aviation, like so many other industries, and they're on track for that. And so, I think the wake-up call for the West needs to be, look, they have a track record of doing this. I have no idea if they're going to succeed in AI, but they've definitely succeeded in other areas. And that is the big challenge, is that they're putting all their resources into doing this, to being the leaders in this technology. This technology will have huge implications for so many other sectors. And so it's not just, I think, a question for Latin America to say, well, are we going to kind of, choose the US model or the Chinese model, or, how will it, who will win that Cold War? I think the real question is, well, is China going to come in and dominate some of our sectors too, where we're performing really well? Because they want to take over every advanced sector, every sector that has, this high, high productivity, high profit. And so that's where the focus has to be on adoption for every country. It's, how can we use AI to increase productivity? How can we make sure that we're using AI to, basically, as a factor of production? Because that's what China is doing across every sector. And so that's what I think the urgent need needs to be in countries, is think about how is this going to affect our economy 5-10 years from now, because that's going to be the really important issue.
Thank you, Daniel. Marcos, your final words, please.
Well, thank you for the invitation for this discussion. I learned a lot, not being an expert on AI. I hope, I could give you enough context on what's going on with geopolitics besides AI. And yes, thank you again to everyone.
Thank you. Daniel, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you as well. I've learned a lot. It's a great discussion. Appreciate you for having me.
Thank you. Gennaro?
Yeah, I have learned a lot too. It's great to see and to hear about the geopolitical implications of technology. As a technician myself, I mean, we tend to focus on the practical impacts of the technology, but we often don't understand everything that happens in a geopolitical sense. And I think that for AI, it's particularly very important because I think it has the potential of shaping our future society.
Okay. Thank you all.